Good evening, everybody. My name is Hannah Luden. I am the director of CIDI, and I'm very happy to welcome you all, and especially our guest, Ben Lev-Kadesh. Ben, before I give you the floor, I want to make a short introduction in Dutch about yourself. I hope you recognize yourself. Ben Lev-Kadesh is een docent, activist en tourguide in Israël. CIDI en Ben go a long way back. Hij heeft altijd is hij verbonden aan ons en hij geeft vaak leiding aan, of rondleidingen, vooral in Jeruzalem, aan mensen die wij meenemen naar Israël. Bijvoorbeeld de docentenreizen, maar ook journalistenreizen die we organiseren. Jeruzalem is ook Ben zijn geliefde stad waar hij ook woont. Ben zelf heeft zich gespecialiseerd in politiek onderwijs. Hij heeft zowel geschiedenis, onderwijs als conflictwetenschappen gestudeerd aan de Hebreeuwse Universiteit in Jeruzalem. Hij is alumnus ook van de Mandel School for Educational Leadership. En daar heeft hij een uniek model ontwikkeld voor burgerschapsonderwijs. En dat is natuurlijk iets wat hier in Nederland heel erg speelt, want ook wij worstelen met de vraagstukken rond burgerschapsonderwijs. In 2015 richtte Ben samen met anderen het zogenaamde Seculiere Forum opnieuw op. Want hij bestond, maar zij hebben een nieuw leven daarin geblazen. Het is een NGO die gaat zich richten op de vraag van wat is nou de invloed van religie op de samenleving. En hoe kunnen we dat op een andere manier bekijken vanuit seculier perspectief en seculier onderwijs. Hij is momenteel actief als rector van een middelbare school in Jeruzalem. En daar focust hij op progressive education, zoals het heet. Met ruimte voor zowel individuen, dus hoe kijkt het individu tegen zijn school en tegen de samenleving, maar ook het collectief en de samenspel tussen het individu en de collectief. Hij ontwikkelde hier een curriculum voor het onderwijzen van seculier humanisme. Dus ook weer een onderwerp dat ook in Nederland speelt. Naast zijn onderwijswerkzaamheden geeft Ben veel lezingen, zoals vanavond. En zoals ik al eerder vertelde, geeft hij ook rondleidingen als tourguide, vooral in Jeruzalem. Ben, many thanks for joining us this evening. I want to, the whole lecture will be in English, so I'm switching to English. I want to remind our viewers on Zoom that if any of you want to pose a question to Ben, you can use the Q&A button in the bottom of your screen, of your Zoom screen. And I will try to pose Ben as many questions as I can. But first, Ben will talk to us for about half an hour, and we'll give an extensive introduction, which maybe will answer already too many of your questions. Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So in the coming 20 minutes or half an hour, I will try and introduce you to the Israeli education system. Let's share a screen. Let's see. Okay. I hope this works. And I will try to tell you about the Israeli education system. But as you can see on the screen, I might be questioning whether there's one Israeli education system, or perhaps we should say Israeli education systems. Because as we can see, although Israeli education system is centralized, practically there are different systems and different schools which have different budget and a different curriculum, and in some cases, as I will tell you, not much regulation on some of the schools. So it is very, very different. And as I will show later on, the difference is mainly by the family and the part of the population in Israel in their own education. So first I would like to tell you about, it's not working for some reason. Hannah, do you see the screen, the PowerPoint? Hannah?
Yes, we can see this. We could, not anymore.
Good, not now, just a second. I'll try it again. Sorry.
Yes, now it's very clear and big.
Now again, but okay, hopefully it will work now. Just a second. Okay, great. So, Israeli education system traditionally started in the age of 5 till recently. About 8 years ago, Israel started subsidizing or giving free education in the public system to the age of 3 as well, 3 to 5, and then again 5 to 6 in kindergarten. About 500,000 children go to kindergartens in Israel, starting the age of 3 all the way to the age of 6, when they move on to elementary school. About 1 million kids go to elementary school from the age of 6 to the age of 12. And then middle school, about 300,000 children or teenagers in middle school, ages of 13 to 15, 7th grade to 9th grade. And eventually high school, age of 16 to 18, grades 10 to 12, where about 400,000 students study these days in the education system of Israel. All in total, about 2.4 million children or teenagers study in the Israeli education system. But as you can see, the system is actually divided into 4 different systems. Traditionally, we would say that the biggest system, or the hegemonic system, the hegemonic population of Israel, is what we call the Hebrew Israeli population. This is just an example from one of the schools of this education system. As you can see, the children here, boys and girls, study in the same school. I will refer now to some characters of this population. Many of you probably know about Israel, visited Israel perhaps, read about Israel, heard previous lectures. So some of the things that we'll say now about different populations will be familiar. These are what we call secular people or traditional people. So these families, Jewish, will see Judaism as their nationality and Israel as their homeland. Many of them were born in Israel. Some of them moved here because of their feelings to the country, to the people of Israel. But basically, they are not religious. So when they go to school, they want to get general education, starting with math, English, history, literature, and studying the Bible as well. I will focus during my explanation on history and the Bible studies, just to explain the difference between the different systems and the difference between the different populations. So when these kids study history, they actually study about the story of their people. And it will go probably about 2,000 years ago, start the history of the Jewish people under the Roman rule in this country. Then the Jews were banished from their own land, and they will return back again in modern times in order to start the state of Israel. So the story, the history, is actually what unites Jewish people from all over the world to come to this land. And this is basically the story that we'll get about the Israeli or the Jewish people, as well as another story that we'll get about general history. So basically, traditionally, in this school system, history, I would say that there was about the same amount of hours and topics studying the Jewish history and general history. But in this school system, I would call it the religious school system. And when I say religious school system, I will always refer to religious Jews. Later on, we will talk about non-Jews in Israel. So the religious Jews, they mainly separate kids, boys and girls, to different schools. And in some cases, boys and girls to different classes. However, when these kids go to school, they will also get math, English, science, history, and Bible. But when they study the history, they will focus more on Jewish history than on general history. So if I said before that in the previous system I just explained about, the biggest system, it's about half and half, general history and Jewish history. In this case, I would say that maybe 2/3 of the topics and hours will be dedicated to Jewish history, and only about 1/3 to general history. When we say general history, we mainly mean Western or European history. So the main focus of historical studies is about the Jewish people. And in this system, although the teachers all come from university, you might find here and there in some school books explanations which usually are not explanations that historians will give, such as God or religious belief as something explaining the course of history. Let's talk a few words about biblical studies. So in this system, the Hebrew system or the general system, the Bible is a great book, the bestseller of in history, and it's the story of the Jewish people. Most kids, most parents, many teachers will probably say that big parts of the Bible are true. But they will also have in mind that some parts of the Bible are maybe nice stories, but not definitely real truth. The teacher in class will probably not talk about the difference I just mentioned, because this might be upsetting for some of the kids in class, or for some of the parents, or maybe some of other teachers in the same school. But it's well known that the Bible was written by people. The kids in higher school, teenagers will study a bit criticism of the Bible, understanding that it was written by human beings and that some of the events are not historical, didn't really happen. But if I have a poll in 12th grade, probably most of them will believe that the story of Exodus is true, while many historians and archaeologists have some doubts about it. However, the Bible is not only considered as an important book in the eyes of the teachers and kids in this school, but also the book of the people of Israel, the book of the Jewish people, something that the Jews are very proud about. In this school system, the religious one, obviously the Bible is something holy. It was not written by people, but written by God. Everything in it is true and really happened. And when we read the Bible, we read a holy text. By the way, as you can see, the kids here do not have a kippah on their head. They are not religious. In this school system, obviously, boys will have a kippah on their head, and the biblical studies will be only part of the holy text they learn. They will also learn the Talmud. Some of you probably know the book, which is a later interpretation for the Bible and a set of rules of how you should behave. So while these kids would get only some Jewish education, mainly history, some of the Bible, these kids will get a much wider Jewish education. Now I go on to others. Oh, by the way, just to say, math and English are supposed to be equal in both systems, but we can see again and again in different tests that this system will have most of the average grade in math and science and English will be higher than in this one. So in a way, there's a focus in the general Hebrew system on general education, a bigger focus than in the religious system, which will be more traditional and conservative. Now we go on to the ultra-Orthodox system. About 20% of the kids in Israel go to this system. As you can see, only boys in class and in school, and other schools will only have girls. This school system does not accept or only partly accept the curriculum that the state made. So they will learn some math and some English to the age of 12, the end of elementary school, and later on, not at all. They will only focus on religious studies or the holy text, mainly the Talmud. They would be experts in reading the Talmud. They will learn each page of the Talmud for many weeks, but they will have almost no education in what I would call general knowledge, such as history and literature and science. And this is speaking about the boys. Girls will have more general education, but not as high in the other systems, because they also focus on religious studies in a different way than the boys. Obviously, only men teach the boys, and mainly women teach the girls. This is a much more conservative school system. Respect to teachers is much higher than the other systems I just mentioned. As we can see in this picture, the kids rise up and stand while their rabbi, their teacher, speaks to them. In these systems, mainly in this one, it's very progressive. So in many cases, kids and teachers will speak very freely one with another, one with each other, sometimes even a bit rude. In this school system, it will be much more conservative and much more formal. Taking us to the last school system, the Arab school system. So in Israel, about 20% of the population is Arab, most of them Muslim, some of them Christian, some of them Druze, and some of them Bedouin, which are Muslim, and they go to the Arab school system, which has a different curriculum. Again, a mixture of general knowledge and a local knowledge, which is whether it's Muslim or Christian. They will study the holy text, the Quran or the New Testament, and a bit focus on the history of a bit bigger focus on the history of the Middle East compared to the curriculum in the other school system I mentioned. Till a few decades ago, these kids used to study the Jewish Bible and they studied Zionism. But a few decades ago, it changed and they get more focused on their own subjects, their own history and holy book compared to what it used to be. I'll just go back to the percentage. As we can see, 43% of the population goes to the general Hebrew system, but it used to be much higher. When the country just started, it was about 90%. And as time passes, the ultra-Orthodox system becomes bigger and bigger, while the religious system is very stable. And the Arab system is becoming bigger and bigger, but recently, in the past few years, the percentage of growth every year is lower than what it used to be. So looking forward, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, we expect that probably what will happen, that the Hebrew system will shrink, the ultra-Orthodox system will become bigger, religious system will probably stay about the same size, and Arab system will become bigger, but not much bigger. So looking forward to the future of Israel, the education the children here will get will be very different than these days. Many more kids, if it continues the same way, will get deep knowledge in the Jewish traditional religious texts, but almost no knowledge in science or English or math or history or other knowledge which most Western countries will see as something which you must have in order to find yourself and succeed in this world, definitely in the global world. And many people talk about the future of Israel when this is a situation, when there are big doubts about the abilities of many or more and more children in this country to find a job, to go to university. What we can see in this table is that what I just explained is only focusing on the curriculum and regulation. I told you about 4 different systems: the general Hebrew system and the religious system, and most of the Arab schools all belong to what we call the formal education system, which is 100% under regulation of the Ministry of Education. The curriculum is very strict. I'm a school principal. I have almost no way to decide what will be as a subject that the kids here will study. It's almost all decided in the Ministry of Education. And at the end of high school, there are final tests, which are very, very strict. And we have to obey the rules about what will the kids learn. Well, actually, I can decide that they will learn other things, but then we won't have enough time to teach them and prepare them for the final tests. So what actually happens is that almost all schools follow the orders from the Ministry of Education, and they teach 100% of the curriculum. Well, we get 100% subsidized by or financed by the government. So the government basically says, well, we give you money, you teach what we decide you will teach. We have some freedom, but not much. What about the recognized but non-formal? Most of these schools are ultra-Orthodox. Some of them belong to the church, so these are Arab schools. These schools get much freedom, and they get 75% financed. So basically the deal is, we give you money, but not as much money as we would have gave you if you would have followed the curriculum. And finally, these school systems, except, which are all ultra-Orthodox, they have no regulation, and they get only 55%. Basically, would say this should be illegal. How come a school system or a school will decide what would be taught in the school when the government has such a centralized education system? So what they would basically say, well, we don't get money, so we teach what we want. The government would like to have more regulation on these schools, but practically nothing changed for many, many years, and probably nothing will change. A few years ago, for those of you who follow politics here in Israel, a few years ago, Yair Lapid was in the government, and he basically had a choice whether he wanted, and the Orthodox were not in the government, first time after many, many years. And Yair Lapid, as a politician, and he was a major politician in that coalition, had to choose whether to fight to force the ultra-Orthodox to go to the army, or to fight and force them the curriculum. Eventually, he decided to fight so they will go into the army. It didn't work, he didn't stay in the coalition, but we can see that even when they had a chance, secular politicians that could force the Orthodox to have their regular curriculum and give them better chances to go to university, find a job that will earn more money, they decided not to go into that field for different reasons. But obviously, it will create a big fight with the ultra-Orthodox. They say, we have our own beliefs, our own tradition and culture. We don't want your culture, and we're willing that the government will not give us the same amount of money as they give to other schools. We will manage on our own. Other people in Israel say, the country can't allow a situation in which 20% of the kids won't get what we say should be the basic knowledge in the 21st century. Or at least they say the government should not subsidize these schools. So this is a topic that many people will talk about and argue about, speaking of the education system. I'm going on, but if any of you has questions about these topics, I will refer to them later on. So now some more subject which people talk about. So what we see here in this picture is children and adults, parents demonstrating because of how crowded the classes are in Israel. The tables here show us, and I apologize, it's in Hebrew, but I will translate, the average amount of children, students in each class in the OECD, 21 students in a class. Israel is number one in the OECD with 27 students per class in elementary school. Looking in middle school, the average is 23 students in class, and Israel is almost the highest, just after South Korea. Israel with 28.7, nearly 29 children in classroom in middle school. Now this is the average. If you come to Jerusalem, my city, or go to Tel Aviv, big city in Israel, the classes are much more crowded. It's about 37 or 38 children in middle school and about 32 children in elementary school. So how comes the average is so low compared to what I just described in the two biggest cities in Israel? The reason is that the ultra-Orthodox system has mainly smaller classes and tiny villages in the side of Israel or on the other side of the Green Line in the West Bank will have smaller classes. This is due to the fact that when it's a religious school, they separate boys and girls. So if it's a bunch of tiny schools, tiny villages, and they have one school, they won't have enough children or enough boys and enough girls to create very crowded classes. So basically, the bottom line is that Israeli classes, mainly in the big cities, are very crowded, much more crowded than the average in the OECD. Some of you probably wonder, what about the Netherlands? Well, this picture is out of the Israeli newspaper, and either the Netherlands are not in the table, or maybe the amount of children in each class is lower than the bottom of this table. Finland in orange in elementary school, 19 children, and Denmark, 20 children in middle school. So either the Netherlands are in a better situation or just were not counted this year when this picture was published, when this table was published in the paper. I go on. So another topic which many people talk about is the salary of teachers. In the very beginning of Israel, say the 50s, 60s, even the 70s perhaps, being a teacher was very respected. And the salary was maybe not very high, but in general, this country was not very rich, and there wasn't a big gap between rich and poor. So a teacher was respected, and the salary is pretty good. Ever since the 70s and 80s, Israel became more capitalized, and the gap between salaries became bigger. And as time passed, teachers did not get much respect. It wasn't considered to be a good job. Definitely not the salary. It is now changing again, and we'll explain in a second. However, we can see in this table the green and blue lines. The green line refers to the salary of teachers, and the blue line to the salary of school heads, principals. The dots on the table, the black dots on this side and the white dots on this side, show us the average salary of a person with about the same education as the teachers or the school heads. As we can see in the case of Israel, in the same amount of education, teachers will get lower salary than the average worker with the same amount of education.
Ben, I must correct you. It's just the other way around. The green ones are the heads of schools, and the blue ones are the teachers.
Sorry, thank you for the correction. Okay. On the other side, teachers, the blue line, a bit lower than the average salary of a worker with the same education. I said this is now changing. A few years ago, about 5 or 6 years ago, there was a big reform in the salaries of teachers. And these days, teachers in middle school and high school are much better than what they used to be. I believe that in 5 years from now, 10 years from now, being a teacher will get more respect than what it used to be till recently, due to the salary. And yet, the salaries in elementary school are still very, very low. And this maybe explains the table we're looking at right now. I'll go on. So this is maybe more interesting for those of you who are educators, teachers. This table shows us the percentage of hours each week, working time, that the teachers actually teach. So what other things do teachers do besides teaching? Some people here are now asking themselves, well, preparing the lesson, checking tests, having meetings with parents and children, many other tasks that teachers have to do every week. In Israel, as we can see, nearly 60% of the hours in working time each week is dedicated for teaching. The Netherlands are right here, touching the average with about 45 or 43% of working time. This is considered to be much, much better. This means that teachers have more time to develop their skills, to learn one from another, to prepare their classes. We guess, or we can assume, that the teaching will be much more effective due to the fact that they have more time. Well, Israel is not in the worst situation in the OECD, as we can see, but many countries are in a better situation. And one of the biggest complaints of teachers in Israel is not only about the salary, not only about the classes, which are very crowded, but the fact they need to teach so much. I'm a school principal, and I need to teach 8 hours a week. It's not that much, but take in mind that as a school head, I have lots of other jobs. And in other countries, or many other countries, school managers, principals don't teach it all. Okay, numbers again. Well, this is a bit complicated, but basically what this table shows us is how much money is invested per student in the country. I will refer to the colors in a second. So Luxembourg, a lot of money per student, while in Mexico here, much less. Israel seems to be somewhere in the middle, but lower than the average we can see here in the EU. Okay, now about the colors. The blue marks the public money, and the orange marks private money. If we take a look at the United States, for example, okay, a lot of money is invested per student, but a big percentage of it is private money. Parents pay for private education in the United States, as we probably all know, whether it's in high school or later on in college. In Israel, much less private money compared to the United States, but more than in many other countries we can see here in this table. So the bottom line is that in Israel, the amount of money that invested per student is lower than the average among these countries. I am showing you this table mainly to compare it to the next table over here, which shows us the percentage of the GDP that is invested in education. Remember, I said just a second ago that in Israel, not much money is invested per student, but we can see that the percentage out of the GDP is almost the highest among all countries that were checked. I think it's the countries of the OECD, yes. So how come Israel is investing such a big percentage, it's about 6% of its GDP in education, but so low is given per student? Where is all the money, some people will ask? Well, the answer is two answers. A, the Ministry of Education here is very strong. Education is centralized here. So a lot of the money goes to the government, to the education, to those who plan the school system and don't actually run it. I will compare it to Finland, which a few years ago was in a big crisis, economic crisis. They didn't have much money. So they decided to smaller the education ministry and the people who work for it, and they gave more autonomy to the schools. They didn't only save money, but also made the education system in Finland to be now one of the best ones in the world. And people from all over the world go to Finland to study what they exactly did and what they do now. But the main explanation for the gap between this table showing us that Israel is not spending much money per student to this table showing us that Israel uses a big percentage of its GDP for education. The main explanation is that Israel has a lot of kids. So a big percentage of the GDP needs to finance many, many kids. While many countries, mainly in Europe, the percentage of children in the population is much lower. Some people would say now, let's take a look again at the 4 different education systems. And then many Israelis will say, oh, the ultra-Orthodox and the Arab have more children than other populations in Israel, but what they give to the GDP, the amount of money they earn, is much lower. This means that these families are poor, many of them are poor, but their children will get proper education, giving us hope that these children will perhaps have a better future, finance future, than the present, the family in which they now grow up. Okay, this table shows us what happens though the kids that finish high school, whether they got their diploma or not. And we can see here that about Israel is in the bottom of the table. About 55% of the students in Israel that actually graduate high school will get the diploma or will finish successfully the final tests. 55% is very, very low. We just said that Israel is trying to invest big percentage of the GDP in education. The explanation is that 20% of the kids, the ultra-Orthodox, don't even take the final tests. And besides the ultra-Orthodox, some kids don't succeed in tests, others go to the vocational education system, and etc. By the way, another interesting question is how come all countries show us what happened with the kids 2 years after? They probably a bigger percentage succeeded in the final tests. How come in Israel we don't even have a mark of what happened to the kids 2 years after? The answer is that about 40% of the children in Israel about 60% of the children in Israel go into the army. So they don't have a chance to continue on their studies. And this is why it's unfair to compare Israel to other countries, checking whether the kids finished finished education system eventually and took the final test in a bigger success. And we're about to end. This is in Hebrew again. I apologize. But what we can see here is the different parts of the society checking the amount of money each family earns. So 10 basically is the richest families or richest population, and 1 is the poorest. And what this table shows us is the amount or the percentage of children that actually succeeded in the final test. These are the purple diagrams. So we can see that rich children or children who came from rich families have bigger success in final test than all other. In other words, a child that was born to a poor family, here 1 and 2, has lower chances to succeed compared to those who were born in the richest families. In other words, according to statistics, better chances that the poor children will remain poor and perhaps will have poor children in the future compared to those who were born in rich families. This might seem to be obvious, but it's important to say that one of the main goals of the education system in Israel is to smaller the gap between rich and poor, give better chances to the poor families and poor children, make it equal chances to succeed. But although there are some efforts to do it, giving more money to schools in the poor villages and sections of the Israeli society, although there are some efforts to do it, there's hardly no success. Making the gap smaller or giving better chances to different populations. Last thing, I want to show you the success of Israeli students in international tests. So here on the right, it's in Hebrew again. Israel was compared to other countries in the world in 3 topics. Reading, China is number 1, 555 points. The average is 487 points, and Israeli kids get 470 points, number 37 in the world. Science, China again is number 1. Israel is number 42. And math, China again number 1. China and Macau lead again and again and again. Israel is number 41. So Israel has big success in education. For an example, if you check the percentage of the population that went to university and get high education, Israel is very strong. It's about 30% in the past few years of the Israeli youngers who go to university and get high education. But speaking of the future, we see that Israel is not very succeeding. And these tests do not count the ultra-Orthodox. They don't even go and take the tests. So Israel's future, we have some doubts about it. And I would like to show you and compare between Israel and the Netherlands. Just a second. Now on the net. Comparing the success in the PISA test. Okay. So I'm comparing now Israel and the Netherlands. First, we take reading, succeeding in the reading test in PISA. So you can see that the Netherlands.
Just a minute, Ben. You're not sharing the screen. You're still sharing your PowerPoint.
Okay, so just a second. And sorry, do you see now the screen?
Yes, yes.
So we can see that the Netherlands is a bit better than Israel in reading. Same about science and math. It's even bigger. What is more interesting, I think, is checking according to the economic situation of the family. So when we check the more wealthy families, we can see the success of the Netherlands is higher than in Israel. When we go to average families, this is the new line you can just see now. The success is still bigger than in Israel, but the gap in the Netherlands is bigger than what it is here in Israel. And eventually, when you go to the lower classes, we can see the Netherlands success is much bigger than in the lower classes in Israel. And we can see that the gap is between rich and poor in the Netherlands is not as big as a gap between rich and poor in Israel. The bottom line is that the education system in Israel, in the Netherlands, probably has better chances to give better future to the poor families in the Netherlands compared to those in Israel. And this takes us to one of the main claims against education system here, or against the Israeli economy, that eventually, if you check the Israeli population and you don't include the ultra-Orthodox and the Arabs, Israel has a big success. But when you do count the ultra-Orthodox and the Arabs, what I think you should do, they're Israeli citizens, you find that the situation of Israel, when you compare it to other countries in the Western world, is not very good and will probably be even worse in the future. And this is why many people call the Israeli government to improve the education system, giving these children better future and giving Israel better success in the future. That's it, and I'm now open for questions. Thank you very much.
Hoppa. No, it refuses to show me. So, oh yeah, here I am. Thank you very much, Ben. You talked actually a lot about the politics of education. Maybe we should make a sidestep and go into the content of education. What would you say is the most remarkable educational element in the Israeli education system? Is it teaching the Bible in all aspects of the society, or would it be English teaching or anything else?
So it depends who you ask, but mainly in the general Hebrew school system, most parents will care more about math and science and English than other subjects. But when you go to the religious system, perhaps more people would say, oh no, biblical studies, religious studies are most important. The parents are willing to pay more money to give extra classes in these subjects. You go to the ultra-Orthodox system, parents basically say, we don't need to learn math or English. All we need to learn is religious studies. And when you go to the Arab school system, the answer would definitely be science and math. This is our way to improve our situation in the Israeli society, getting a better job.
Yes.
Did I answer the question?
Yeah. Is it true that in the list of the best performing schools of Israel, there are at least in the top 10 there are at least 2 Arab schools?
Well, yes. Well, actually, Druze schools. I'm not sure everyone here is familiar with Druze. Druze is a nation and a religion. Originally came from the Islam about 800 years ago. And it's a separate population in Israel. They do not see themselves as part of the Arabs, but in the eyes of the Jews, they are part of the Arabs in this country. And it's true that in the past few years, 2 of the best schools in Israel were Druze schools. It's a different story, but it's very, very interesting because it's not a very rich population or strong population, but there were just terrific school principals that practically did magic in those 2 schools. It's amazing.
Yeah. So it's maybe the difference between the micro and the macro in every country, and some exceptions which may show. But do you think there are lessons to be taken from these schools, and are they being taken by the general education system?
So perhaps I'm not the person to ask. I should ask the Minister of Education. But basically, I'd say it's very well known. People in the country, I think, heard about it. I'm not sure much lessons were taken to other places. It's something about the belief of the importance of education, maybe a message given to the kids in these schools about this is your only way out. I'm not sure I'm not sure that anyone took lessons from those school principals and teachers about how to do it different in other sites.
Mm-hmm. And what you did not mention, and I think it's indeed very small in Israel, is the attempts of having how shall I say, mixed schools between Jewish children and Arab children. Could you elaborate a bit about that and how big it is?
So I showed you basically how school systems are separated. In the past 20 years, started 2 kinds of schools which are actually trying to do a mixture. One has a mixture of Jews and Arabs, and the other has a mixture of religious and secular kids. The basic idea in these 2 schools or 2 kinds of schools is that we all live in one society. We should learn one about another. We should live together, and give us as a society a better future, not rivals and fights, but living together. So you asked about the Jewish and Arab schools. Not that many. I think it's about 20 in the whole country. One here in Jerusalem, one in Tel Aviv, one in Haifa, etc. And it's very complicated. I have friends teaching in those schools. And take, for instance, the Memorial Day. Memorial Day is what Jews would say it's the Israeli soldiers who died defending the country. But in the eyes of the Arabs, those soldiers died perhaps occupying the territories in which Arabs, Palestinians live in. Do we have a ceremony in that day? Would we have the kids wearing white shirts and sad stories about those who died in war? Or maybe we just ignore the day. It may, as probably Arab schools would do. So many, many dilemmas every day, every week of living together. It's very, very challenging, but I think it's a huge success. Kids who do graduate in those schools are very optimistic, believe in a better future. They have friends which are very different from them. And more people send their children to these types of schools, whether it's a mixture of Jews and Arabs or religious and secular. It's becoming bigger, and yet the school system is very separated in general.
Yeah. Yeah, but of course, the importance of these schools is, and these discussions you mentioned, is that it is a microcosmos of the discussion within the Israeli society, which is of course very important, and in a controlled environment may be healthier to be carried out. Can we go back to the content of schooling? Could you maybe discuss a little bit questions regarding to educating kids to be citizens? I'm talking about history, I'm talking about society, I'm talking about democratic principles, and talking about tolerance or intolerance, questions of identity.
So identity education is very, very important here. And the question is, what is the identity you want to educate the child to? So basically, in the Hebrew school system, the answer would be Jewish and democratic. So Jewish, he will learn the Bible, history, literature, geography of Israel, as I mentioned before. And he will start this education in second grade when he starts biblical study. It will go all the way to 12th grade. In the same time, he will also get democratic education. But formal civil education, say democracy or democratic rules and principles, will only start in 9th grade, many, many years after the kids started studying the Bible and the history of the Jewish people. So one of the claims against the Hebrew general school system is that it focuses on the Jewish identity, but not as much as on the democratic identity or rules or beliefs. And then some people would say this maybe explains why in politics we can see that Israel is becoming more traditional, right-wing, identified with Judaism, compared to democratic, identified with the left wing. Now, speaking of other education systems, it's totally different. Ultra-Orthodox don't teach at all the democratic principles and ideas. Arabs do teach democratic ideas, and only some focus on the Arab tradition and history and language. But the Arab teachers are very, very afraid to talk about politics. Basically, Arab school systems get equal budget as Jewish school systems, and the same freedom. But the feeling of many people in the school systems in different school systems here is that you better not talk about politics. You might get in trouble with the parents or perhaps with the Ministry of Education. Although if you check the rules of the Ministry of Education, they actually say you should talk about politics. You should talk about what's going on. You are allowed to do so. And yet it's complicated. I don't want to go on, but in the past few years, there were some cases in which teachers were nearly fired because ideas they presented in front of their students.
And do you refer with that to the Arab society or to the Arab minorities, or do you refer in a general situations?
I now refer to the general society, the
I
Hebrew
see.
school system.
Yeah.
In the religious system and in the ultra-Orthodox system, the teachers feel very free to talk about their opinions. They will mainly talk about belief in God, connection to the land, and here and there they will speak about politics. I will now take maybe an example. Many years ago, 15 years ago, it's quite a while, but during big demonstrations all over the country against an Israeli political decision to evacuate Israel settlers from the Gaza Strip, Jewish religious schools took the students during school day, using money given by the government, took them to demonstrate against the government decision. And this was respected by the government, and many parents supported the decision of the school. They said, well, it's important for us to demonstrate for our beliefs. But a few years later, when an Israeli teacher in the general Hebrew school system criticized the IDF, he was nearly fired. And these two topics, these two events, I think, are well known among many Israeli teachers that have a feeling that in the religious school system, politics is part of the thing you talk about, and that many of the teachers have the same agenda, so they're educated to this agenda. While in the general school system, the Hebrew one, you better not go into these topics.
But could it also be that there is a shift and a change in the attitude towards the way teachers should pronounce their own opinions in front of classes? Could it be a matter of time, just changes of our attitude towards that?
It is a matter of time, I agree. And again, the rule, if you check the formal rule, teachers are allowed to do so and encouraged to do so in all different systems. Mm-hmm. Israel is now going through a big, as you probably all know, a big social crisis, political crisis. There's lots of tension, and many people feel that if they're not talking the proper things in class, a kid might feel that maybe he shouldn't speak because a teacher might be angry, and people from different parts of the political map would maybe prefer to be silent than to speak out.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and do you think it's something which is of a concern?
It's very concerning. I think it's very hard to educate, to be, to know what's going on, to be involved in what's going on, if it's not spoken in schools. Mm-hmm. And Israel has a high percentage of people who actually vote in elections compared to many countries in the world, and yet it's declining. Israeli society used to be much more political, and many more people were involved compared to these days. I believe it has to do with the fact that many schools prefer not to go into topics which are contested.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that the curriculum, or maybe even the school books, have changed, or have they more or less remained the same? So regarding these two topics, of course.
Compare how long ago you asked, because it used to be many years ago that the government wrote the school books. About 30 years or so, maybe even more, it was allowed that private people and companies will write their own books, and they will be approved by the government. So speaking of the past few decades, you could see different ideas in school books, perhaps more progressive, more liberal, people would say more left-wing. And there's a big criticism in the past 4 or 5 years. The government changed the one book that is taught in civil studies and made it more what people describe right-wing, more conservative, less liberal, a different idea of what democracy is. And I will end by saying that there is a big argument. Some people would say democracy is the right of the majority to rule. Other people will say, no, the whole idea about democracy is the right of the minority, civil rights. And each side will claim that the other side, when they have power, the Minister of Education, they educate to one type of democracy and almost ignoring the other type.
Mm-hmm. Does that also apply to the fact that you are involved in this endeavor regarding humanity as a point of view?
Pardon, I didn't get the question. If you can repeat it.
In my introduction, I said that you are part of an enterprise, of an NGO working on humanity as an aspect, as opposed to religion. Does that have any room in the school systems in general, or in your work in particular?
So the NGO I'm involved in claims that there's not enough and hardly any education for humanity, well, not humanity, but for civil rights and the idea of universalism, and too much focus on particular stories, narratives, such as the Jewish narrative. This is a claim that is being presented by this specific NGO. I personally, of course, believe in it, but I must be honest and tell you that the Minister of Education, till recently, said this is nonsense. They're just making up tales. And this is an argument. And in order to answer the question, we need to actually open school textbooks and check what is written inside. We don't have time for it. And obviously, this is not as interesting for you as for people here in Israel. So this is under debate.
Okay, that's interesting. And we'll keep in touch to know and learn more about that. And what you're saying, at least, is the school system is very dynamic and evolving, right?
All the
Discussions.
Time. This is a nice thing about education. It's always dynamic because the kids change.
Yes, and their teachers too.
We try.
Okay, Ben, I'm sorry to say that the time is over. We've been together for an hour now, which was fascinating to listen to you and to learn more about Israel. I want to thank you very much for your time and your effort, and I hope our viewers have learned and got a more feeling about the Israeli complex. I think the president called them tribes, the 4 tribes of the Israeli society, but also about the challenges of the education system regarding keeping one society and a better educated future for all Israelis. Thank you very much again. I want to thank our listeners as well, and tell you that if anybody missed anything or wants to share this lecture with anybody else, it will come tomorrow on our channels. It has been recorded and will be available from tomorrow on our channels. I thank you again for joining us. You're mostly welcome to support us in many different ways. And I do hope, Ben, that we can meet in person in Israel in the coming, in the foreseeable future, because of course our trip, which was planned for the summer, was canceled, and our trip with teachers, which was planned for the end of this year, has been shifted to May. But I still hope we will be able to come over and meet you again. I want to tell our public, if there are any other questions you want to ask, you can mail them to us and we can forward them to Ben. I wish everybody a very good night, and it's almost the end of this year. So we'll see everybody maybe next year and maybe before that in different occasions. Have a very good evening, and Ben, many thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you for the interest.